Welcome to the One Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. Mosiah chapter 20 and chapter 21. Chapter 20 overview. Some of the Lamanite daughters are abducted by the wicked priests of Noah, but the Lamanites think the people of Limhi kidnapped them, so they come to fight. The men of Limhi fight valiantly, so that the king of the Lamanites is wounded and left for dead. The men discover him and bring him back alive so that Limhi can kill him. Instead, Limhi has him explain why they attacked, and Gideon says that the priests of Noah must have kidnapped the young women. So the king of the Lamanites is pacified, promises not to destroy them anymore, and peace is restored. This being more or less straightforward narrative, there are only a couple of points I found worthy. Verse 1 sounds like it was taken from Judges 21, with the daughters gathering together to dance. And in describing the valiant fighting of the people of Limhi against the Lamanites, verse 11 says they fought like dragons. I wonder if Mormons think that this was just a figure of speech, or if they think dragons really existed at that point in human history. Chapter 21 overview. The two separate narrations in Mosiah now join with the timeline of the people of Limhi catching up to the time when Ammon and his fellows came by the end of the chapter. Starting at the beginning of the chapter, after the 2 years of peace for no apparent reason, the Lamanites begin to mistreat the people of Limhi, but can't kill them because of the king's oath. The people can't escape because the Lamanites have them surrounded, so they decide to attack the Lamanites, but are defeated 3 times, at which point they humble themselves and pray to God for deliverance. We're not told how long any of this lasts, only at some point Limhi has sent out a small group of people to search for Zarahemla, and they come back having found a ruin that they think was it, coming back only shortly before Ammon and his fellows find it. After Ammon appears, Limhi and the people repent and desire to be baptized, but nobody has the authority to do that, so they try to get out of bondage and make their way to Zarahemla. Verses of interest. In verse 2, the people of Limhi are here called Nephites for the first time, though whether that's because they are descended from Nephi or merely living in the city of Nephi is unclear. In verse 15, after the Lamanites had defeated the people 3 times, killing a great many in the process, we read that the Lord began to soften the hearts of the Lamanites. And of course, I have to ask, what about free agency? How can God soften hearts without violating the most sacred belief of the Mormon, that God gives us free agency? In the next several verses, we read that the people humble themselves, but God is slow to answer them because of their past wickedness. King Limhi commands the people to provide for the widows and orphans of the men who were slain. The people stay banded together, and the king doesn't trust himself outside the walls without his guards for fear of the Lamanites. They also start looking out for the wicked priests who have apparently been sneaking in and stealing food and stuff. We also are told a few more details about the exploring party that found the land covered with dry bones and brought back the gold plates earlier in the chapter, and are reintroduced to Ammon and his brethren, whom the king and guard suppose to be some of the wicked priests, who come up not many days after the other party. Verse 28 is probably the most famous change from the 1830 Book of Mormon to the modern Book of Mormon, because in the original it says that King Benjamin, who had not been king for 3 years at this point and had also recently died, had the gift of translating unknown languages rather than Mosiah. While there are many inconsistencies within the Book of Mormon, this has to be one of the biggest and is rightly corrected in the modern versions. But the question must be, how did it get messed up in the first place? The only reasonable answer is that Joseph Smith just made it up and couldn't keep his story straight. Benjamin had been king for a while and had recently died while Ammon and his men left Zarahemla. Then there was the lengthy excursion in the narrative to bring the reader up to date on the history of the people of Zeniff. So when it was time to unite the 2 strands into one, it would be only natural for Joseph Smith to say King Benjamin. But let us consider the alternatives from the Mormon perspective, starting with the claim that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon from gold plates by the power of God. In this view, these plates were engraved either by the men who lived through the events, and we see this said over and over again in books like 1st and 2nd Nephi, Jacob, etc., written by those men, or a copy was made by Mormon at the end of the Book of Mormon. Obviously, a person who had lived through the events and knew that Ammon had left during the reign of King Mosiah would never have said that it had happened during the reign of King Benjamin. That would be like a person living at the time of Lewis and Clark saying that that expedition happened during John Adams' presidency rather than Thomas Jefferson's. But if it was a copyist error, how could that have happened? How could Mormon have seen the narrative say that Ammon talked about Mosiah but accidentally wrote Benjamin? Moving on to the time of translation, again exploring this problem from the perspective of the Book of Mormon being true. If Joseph Smith said Mosiah, how could the scribe have mistakenly written Benjamin? We're not talking about the difference between Mosiah and Messiah, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. These are two very different sounding names, Benjamin and Mosiah. So we're left with the only option being that Joseph Smith did originally tell his scribe to write, and now Limhi was again filled with joy in learning from the mouth of Ammon that King Benjamin had a gift from God whereby he could interpret such engravings. But if Joseph Smith were merely saying the words that he saw on the magic parchment in the magic hat by revelation from God, and especially if each word would not disappear until and unless the scribe wrote it correctly, which is how at least one early source claimed it was written, how could Joseph Smith have seen Mosiah and said Benjamin? Indeed, the only explanation that is even somewhat reasonable is that Joseph Smith was making it up and made an error. Verses 31 through 32 say that the people now wished to find Alma and join his church, for they themselves had entered into a covenant with God to serve him and keep his commandments. And now, since the coming of Ammon, King Limhi had also entered into a covenant with God and also many of his people to serve him and keep his commandments. Technically, all Israelites were entered into the covenant at birth, or at least all males at the time of circumcision, requiring them to keep God's commandments. This could be taken as evidence that the Book of Mormon peoples didn't circumcise, but I would suspect that the Mormon would just say that this was an extra or additional covenant that the people entered into. And there may be something in the Old Testament about things like this, with people making covenants over and above the one given in the law of Moses, for example, the Nazirite vow. Limhi and many of the people wish to be baptized, but no one has the authority, so they want to join up with Alma, but can't because of the Lamanite guard, though Ammon and his fellows never met this guard, which supposedly was guarding the borders of the land so nobody could get out. And the guard also didn't stop Limhi's earlier search party. So this is yet another inconsistency, or at least a plot hole, in the Book of Mormon.